So Mark 1:1, the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. We talk about Mark, we might call it just Mark or the Gospel according to Mark. We've got 4 Gospels in our Bible, and they all tell the good news of Jesus in some way. And that word gospel just means good news. But Mark seems like he would prefer a different title, and that title is the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. And the book of Mark was written in Greek, and in the original Greek, that entire phrase is just 7 words long. So like half the length that it is in English. And in those 7 little words, Mark has communicated a lot. He's communicated that this book contains good news. He's communicated that this good news is about a man named Jesus, that Jesus is the Messiah. And if you don't know what that word means, that's okay. We'll get to that later. He's communicated that Jesus is the Son of God. And also he's communicated that in some way the good news doesn't end when this book ends, that this book is just the beginning of the good news. So 7 words, and Mark has given us the title, the thesis statement, the main character, and the main truth claim of his book. What in the world, Mark? You might be thinking that's way, way, way too much to pack into 7 words. If this continues at this pace, my mind is going to explode. And I'm here with a comforting message. Get used to it. That's how Mark writes. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. I really wish that I could see all of your faces. Some of you I know, some of you I've never met. And it's super, super exciting to just get to talk about Mark today. My name is Rhett. I'm one of the pastors for Focus at UTD. I went here in 2013, got my marketing degree in 2017, and then promptly did not use my marketing degree. I like basketball, unsweet tea from McDonald's, rap music, walking around in nature, sometimes in storms. If you remember that really bad storm on like Sunday, I took a walk during that. I love God. I love the people at UTD. I really love and enjoy getting to be a campus minister, and I love getting to hear what God has to say to us through the Bible. Guys, the Bible is like genuinely really amazing, really cool. And I'm hoping that comes across as we kind of dive into Mark. And what's exciting for me is that the very first book that I ever kind of took my own deep dive into as a student at UTD was the Gospel of Mark. I was being mentored by essentially our main pastor here, Brandon, the director, one of the directors of this campus, and he kind of shared a commentary about Mark with me, and I dove into that, and I had no idea that some years later I would get to talk about it for a whole semester. So this is really meaningful to me. Cool. So before we get started, we're just going to do a quick little 3-minute syllabus day. So there are 3 things that I want to ask of you. First thing is to take notes. We have these short little pithy sayings that we have in Focus. We call them axioms. And essentially it's like a proverb, a short, important thing that we want to build our culture on. And one of them is that the dullest pencil is sharper than the sharpest mind when it comes to remembering things. Essentially, like, it doesn't matter how good you think you are at taking notes. If you're taking notes, the chances are very, very likely that you'll remember what you're listening to much better than if you chose not to take notes. So I'd encourage you, maybe you have your phone, maybe you have a pen and paper, whatever you have, maybe like etch it onto like a brick wall with a rock, if it's your brick wall. Next is to spend time in Mark on your own. I think I put just read the material, right? It's God wants to speak to you through this, and maybe he wants to do that through me and through this time, but I can almost guarantee that he also wants to do that through you diving into it on your own. We don't have time to talk about every single little detail of Mark, but if you read through it, then I'm sure that God can use that to speak to you in some other ways as well. And then the third thing, kind of related to that, is to ask questions. On one hand, I mean, don't be afraid to wrestle with the text. If there are things that confuse you, that don't make sense to you, don't be afraid of that. Write those things down. On the other hand, what I mean is that feel free to ask questions of the people around you, And also, like every 3 or 4 weeks, we plan on doing a Q&A time where I think Brandon and I, potentially more people, will be answering questions that you have. So if you hear something and you're like, that makes no sense, and then you don't ask us at the Q&A, that's your fault. The second thing is there are 3 things I think you can expect from this deep dive time. The first one is that you probably won't understand everything you hear, and then you probably won't agree with everything you hear. And both of those things are okay. Both of those things are even good. Don't try to agree with and understand and totally track with every single thing. Just sit back and listen. The next is that I will not, like I said, I won't talk about every single thing in the text. You'll see, even from Mark 1, there's a lot. There's just a lot. And that's okay. Even Mark, I think, when he was choosing to write down his gospel, he had an entire, years of ministry from Jesus, and he had to choose, what do I talk about? What do I write down? And now us here in 2020 kind of have to pick, like, okay, what are the things that we have time to really dig into? And the last thing is that I will repeat things. I'll repeat points, and that's okay. That's on purpose. There are certain things that Mark takes the time to say over and over again, or to have Jesus to remind us that Jesus says over and over again. And that's on purpose on his part, so it's going to be on purpose on our part. Okay, so Mark has said 7 words in Greek, which is like more words than I've said in Greek, because I don't speak Greek. But he said like a lot of things using those 7 words. And he's going to keep doing that throughout this entire gospel. But I think you'll see that it's especially crazy in this first chapter. Some of the other gospels start off a bit slower. So Matthew starts off with this really long genealogy of like, this person's son was named this, and their son was named that. And it feels like a history book. And then Luke starts out with a story of like a birth narrative of like, this is how John the Baptist was born. This is how Jesus was born. And it feels like a nice little biography. And then John starts out and it's just this crazy philosophical, like the word became flesh. And you're like, am I sitting in on a conversation between like Plato and one of his students right now? And then Mark is more like, I'm sure most of you have seen at least one of the Avengers movies, but I feel like they always start off just like, bam, action scene. And the Hulk's like punching stuff and the Black Widow's like punching stuff. And like her hair looks different again. And you're like, when are you going to learn to be content with your hair? And then Tony Stark is like flying around and he's like making like pretty stupid jokes. And Captain America has like a new shield or something. There's just a lot going on. And you're like, whoa, there's a lot. And that's what Mark feels like. It's just a lot all at once, right when you start. Mark, I think, writes his gospel in a way where he communicates some really serious and important truths. But he surrounds that with what I think is a really riveting and entertaining work of literature. Right? And that's really cool. I think on the slide there, I have a terrible drawing of a burger, and the meat of the burger is truth, and the bread of the burger is like entertaining things. So I'm sorry about that. If we picture Mark as like each chapter having a set number of scenes, then I think that will help us start to get a grasp of what's happening. So I'm going to recap what you just heard a couple of our students reading, but just kind of picturing the different scenes. And in Mark 1, I count 9 different scenes. So scene 1, there's someone named John the Baptist. And he's baptizing people in the wilderness. So he's dipping them in the water. They're coming to him from all over the place, and they're confessing their sins and their wrongdoings, and he's baptizing them. And in some way to them, this means that they're willing to make a change, that there's forgiveness involved with this. And so he's doing that, but he's also telling people, like, it's not about me. Jesus is coming, and he's much, much, much more important. So scene 2, Jesus comes on the scene. And in a thing that's pretty unexpected, kind of a turn of events, John actually baptizes him, which I feel like normally people who baptize people have some form of spiritual authority over them. But in this case, Jesus submits to being baptized, and he has this amazing experience where it says the Spirit descends on him like a dove, and he hears God's voice telling him, "You are my son. I love you. I'm pleased with you." And that's before Jesus has done any of his ministry. He comes out of that. God's already pleased with him. And we don't really get to appreciate that for very long because scene 3, the Spirit apparently leads Jesus out into the wilderness, and he's tempted by Satan for 40 days, and he's with the wild beasts. He's with angels as well attending to him. Wait, it gets crazier. Scene 4, we're told, kind of an aside, that John the Baptist has been put in prison. But right as that happens, so he's taken away, and then Jesus kind of starts his actual ministry. And we're told that he's going from town to town, or he's going around in a town called Galilee. And he's preaching the good news, and he summarizes it by saying, "The time has come, the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe the good news." So that's kind of how Jesus is summarizing his message. Scene 5. So Jesus has done some preaching. He's like, I need some followers. And so he's walking by the Sea of Galilee. This was like a smaller kind of backwoods area, and there's some fishermen. And he comes across 2 pairs of fishermen. The first, their names are Simon and Andrew. I think most of us know Simon from his other name, which is Peter. So Simon and Andrew, and they're brothers, and there's another pair of brothers named James and John. And kind of both times Jesus is walking by, and he's like he says, like, "Come, follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men." So, like a 2-second pitch, and they're like, "Yes," and they just get out and follow him. And there's just this immediacy to like how quickly they're willing to just get up. James and John are like with their father and some of their employees, and they just say like, "Sorry, Dad," and they just leave and follow Jesus. Scene 6. So Jesus has some followers now. He goes into a synagogue, which is essentially, there's not like a great like one-to-one comparison, but it was kind of like a Jewish, like smaller church area. A lot of teaching from their scriptures happened there. And Jesus goes in and he starts teaching. And that's kind of a daring thing to do. You can picture just like a random person coming up right now and just starting to preach. But people were amazed, and they said that his teaching was super authoritative. And so that's awesome. But also in this synagogue, which again is kind of like a church, there's a man who's demon possessed, and he recognizes Jesus for who he is. Everyone else is kind of like, I'm amazed by him. I don't know who he is. But then this man is like, "Oh my goodness, I know who you are. Like, have you come to destroy me?" And Jesus just says, "Be quiet, come out of him." And the demon is gone. So that's crazy. People are even more amazed after that. And the word starts to kind of trickle out all over the countryside about what Jesus is up to. Scene 7. Jesus has these 4 followers, and he goes to Peter and Andrew's house. Here we learn that Peter is apparently married because he has a mother-in-law, but she's super sick. She has a fever, but you can just imagine being an older woman in a poor area and an oppressed people group in like the year 30 AD. Healthcare is not great. So her having a fever isn't just sort of like, I'll sleep it off. Like it's a bad thing. And Jesus walks up to her and essentially just takes her hand and helps her up like she's like a teammate that fell over and she's better. And she kind of is like, "Oh, would you like some water?" Like she just kind of goes around helping them. And word gets out about that even quicker than the demon possession thing. And so everyone from all over town is like, "Oh my gosh, like my friend is sick, or I'm sick, or my friend can't walk," or all these different things. And they're all coming to Jesus, and he's just healing them all evening. And he's driving out demons, all of that. And so scene 8, I assume that this was a super exhausting thing for Jesus, but he wakes up super early and he's like, "I just need to go be alone with God, have some time in prayer." And so that's what he does. He's super exhausted and he goes and he spends some time with God. But it's cut short because Peter and some other people essentially like hunt him down, and they're like, "Jesus, like the people want to see you." And I imagine him kind of still wiping the sleep out of his eyes. And he's like, "Okay, I'm here to preach. I'm here to bring the news of the kingdom." And so we're told that he again kind of gets up from where he is and goes from town to town, and he's preaching and he's driving demons out in more synagogues. Scene 9, the last scene, is a much more intimate one. So Jesus is approached by a man with leprosy. Leprosy just meant some kind of really bad skin condition at that time. And obviously healthcare wasn't good enough that they could do much about that kind of stuff, but they knew it was probably contagious. And so they would take those people and just kind of separate them, quarantine them off to the side, probably to die. And so this man approaches Jesus, which is already like a no-no, right? Like, what are you doing? You could give me whatever you have. And he asks Jesus, he literally falls on his knees. He's like, please heal me. I know that you can. And Jesus looks at him and he's filled with compassion and he touches him. And the man is made well. And Jesus is like, don't tell anyone. There's essentially a ritual cleaning. He has to go to the religious authorities. Maybe the equivalent now would be like a doctor's note. He's like, go get your doctor's note and go back to what you're doing. And the man's like, totally. And then he just goes and tells everyone, even though Jesus told him not to do that. And we're told that all of these crowds, essentially, there's just more people and they're all converging on Jesus. And so he essentially doesn't have anywhere to rest. His life has changed from that. So this first chapter, I think on like the Bible app, it takes like 5 minutes to listen to the audio. 5 minutes. And a lot has happened. We've gone from, the camera focused on John the Baptist to suddenly Jesus steps in. We don't know anything about him. And then by the end of the chapter, he's a traveling, miracle performing, teaching man with a lot of curious fans, a few men who are devoted and interested enough to actually follow him and kind of give up their own livelihoods to do that. We've been told that Jesus is the Son of God, but outside of maybe John the Baptist and the author, no one really knows that yet. People are just curious about Jesus. And on top of all of that, Mark kind of emphasizes how quickly all of this happens. He kind of connects the different stories with words like at once, immediately, without delay, all this kind of stuff. So verse, you don't have to like look these up. I just want you to get a sense of the pace. Verse 10, Jesus is being baptized, and just as he comes out of the water, he sees heaven torn open, Spirit falling. Verse 12, Jesus has been baptized, and at once the Spirit sends him out into the wilderness. He's walking along the Sea of Galilee. He sees the fishermen. He calls them, and at once they leave their nets. The next two people he sees, without delay, he calls them. News about him after he casts out the demon spreads quickly throughout the region of Galilee. I've got more notes, but I think you've got the picture. There's a lot of different words that Mark uses for quickness and immediacy, but even just the word that we have translated immediately shows up like over 40 times in this little 16-chapter book. Mark wants to communicate that there's just this rush of action, that Jesus is on the move and that he's going somewhere, and we're just kind of along for the ride, trying to figure out what's happening. And we know more than the people that were there. Mark told us some stuff in verse 1, so you can imagine how confused and along for the ride everyone else around him was. I want to kind of help us picture this better with a little analogy. So I've got a little picture there. I want you to imagine that reading the Gospel of Mark or listening to someone else read it is like going on a whitewater rafting tour with a guide in your raft. I've been whitewater rafting once or twice. It's super crazy, and I would not be okay if it wasn't for the guide. But it's super thrilling, right? And according to a Google search I did while drinking coffee on Monday, the best river in the United States for whitewater rafting is one called the Deschutes River in Oregon. And parts of it look really calm, really beautiful, really serene. And then there are sections with these crazy whitewater rapids. There's one picture that literally looks like a staircase with water on it. And I'm like, my boat's supposed to go down that? And so one of the things that contributes to just how enormous the force of this river is that there are things called tributaries, which is essentially a creek or a stream or a smaller river, and they're all feeding into the Deschutes River, and just like all of their force, all of their water is converging and thrusting it forward more, right? And so part of what makes that river so intense to be in is all of the smaller things kind of feeding into it. Reading Mark would be like starting your whitewater rafting tour, and you're like, I wonder if we're going to start over there at like the beginning of the river where it's kind of chill, and then we'll like get ready and then get to the intense part. And then Mark is like carrying the raft and he like drops it like in front of a waterfall or just a really intense section of rapids. He's like, "You ready?" And we just jump in and we're just shooting off and water's flying in our faces. Things are going crazy. And Mark's like, "Welcome to the river. Keep an eye out for rocks. The river's going to take us 6 miles northwest." And he's just like yelling instructions and information while we're rushing down. It's an interesting approach, but I think with our impatient Western minds that it works pretty well. I'm sorry if you could hear me drink that tea. So yeah, it's all a lot. And we can't possibly hope to notice all of the little details in the scenery rushing by us. So I want to kind of simplify things and answer 2 questions that fit within this river analogy about Mark. The first question is, what are all of those smaller streams that are feeding into this main plot river? And the second one is, what is our rafting guide, the author of Mark, what's he telling us to keep an eye out for? So yeah, he drops us right into the rapids, and there's a lot of different plot streams feeding into the main plot river. I just want to tell you about a handful of the different ones that are feeding into it. Again, don't try and like remember every single one. I just want to give you the overall sense of what's going on. So yeah, verse 1, Mark says this is the beginning of the good news. And let's stop right there. We've got our first stream. Good news comes from the Greek word, I'm probably going to butcher this, but it's euangelion. And essentially, that referred to the announcement of a new Roman emperor who had just ascended to the throne or was conquering a new place. And that was a big deal. A Roman emperor was a big deal because the Roman Empire was a big deal. It was huge. It was the most feared, the most honored, the most advanced power in the world. I mean, just think about, like, we study it a lot in 2020, and it's been lots and lots of centuries since then. You can imagine how huge their influence it was, that the ripple effects are still hitting us today. So when Jesus was born, the Roman emperor at the time was a guy named Octavian. In some ways, he was strategic and careful. In some ways, he was ruthless. He had some competition for the throne, and he said sorry and killed them. But he also ushered in what a lot of Roman historians view as like a golden age for the Roman Empire. But then the next emperor, who essentially was in power when Jesus was starting his ministry, was a guy named Tiberius. And he was basically like a great general. He was apparently a quieter guy, but he expanded the Roman Empire even further. So he was super into conquering more territories. So hearing this phrase, good news, euangelion, was essentially like someone saying, hey, there's a new emperor in town, and he's going to make some changes. And, you know, maybe if you're like in Rome, you're like, great. And then maybe if you're a Jew way off to the side being oppressed by them, you're like, maybe don't arrive here. So yeah, Mark says that this good news is about Jesus, the Messiah. Stop right there. That's our second stream. The Messiah is a word from the Hebrew Bible. So Israel as a nation had a lot of different nations that were kind of oppressing them. And the Messiah was essentially someone who was chosen by God to go and free them from that, and kind of sometimes to free them from their own problems as well. And then the end of that sentence, Son of God. While that's a theologically accurate portrayal of Jesus, it also means something to a Roman audience, it was just a title for Roman emperors. So Julius Caesar would refer to him as a god. Octavian referred to himself as a god, and then people after that were like, I'm the son of a god. And so he said all of these things. And then there's a lot of things that kind of come from the Old Testament, so the Hebrew scriptures. I'll try to get through these fairly quickly. There's some references to the creation narrative itself. So just as Jesus is coming out of the water, right, he's in the water and the Spirit comes down on him. And that seems like it's a reference to the very beginning of the Bible. It says that the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters before he began forming things and creating things. So we've got creation in there. There's references to God delivering the Israelites from Egypt. And then there are references to that 40-year period they spent wandering around in the wilderness. It's pretty direct. Jesus is carried out, and he spends 40 days in the wilderness being tempted. There are references to entering the promised land. So the river Jordan, where John the Baptist was baptizing people, is the same river that the Israelites, right after their 40 days, they crossed that river into the promised land. So this meant something to them. And then finally, there's references to prophets from Israel's history. One of them, Mark, comes right out and says, oh, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. And then when you look it up, you're like, oh, Isaiah is half of that quote, and there's another prophet named Malachi. That was a pretty normal thing. If you were quoting two people, one of them was more influential, you just say their name and move on. And there's also a reference to a prophet named Elijah. So John the Baptist is going around doing his ministry. And again, Mark is wasting no words. Like, he's moving quickly. And then randomly, he's like, by the way, he wore a leather belt and he had clothing made of camel's hair and he ate this. And you're like, what? Like, that's a weird detail. Maybe we're used to it, but that's a weird thing to say about someone. But then if you were to read the Old Testament, you'd see that Elijah, this really important prophet, is described in pretty much exactly those words. And Elijah was someone who essentially gave Israel hope by being faithful to God in a time where pretty much no one was. But also he was someone who was supposed to prepare the way for Elisha, who was kind of his successor. And he was supposed to be twice the man of God, twice the prophet that Elijah was. I wonder if there's a connection of someone being more than someone else. Probably not. So yeah, all of that just goes to say that, well, for us, going through those scenes was pretty intense. You can imagine being either Jewish or Roman. And this first part, you're like, oh my gosh, like he's said so much, like there's so much going on. Whether they were a Jew or not, this would have been crazy because essentially Romans and Jews are seeing their entire narratives converge onto Jesus. Everything that they think is impressive and important and powerful, whoosh, right there on Jesus. All of that to say, the author of Mark is doing everything that he can, both overtly and subtly, to show us that Jesus is a big deal. Jesus is so important, and he's on the move. He's going somewhere, and we just got to try to keep up. Right. So we're bouncing around in these rapids at breakneck speed, and like I said, the guide, the author of Mark, is trying to kind of guide our attention to things and prepare us for the rest of this river ride that we're going on. So he's in the boat with us and he's yelling, keep an eye out for this. Don't forget to watch for that. But what's he telling us to keep an eye out for? I'm going to point out two things, but I'm going to phrase them as questions that we can ask ourselves as we go throughout this deep dive series. First, he wants us to be keeping an eye out for what Jesus does with power. What does Jesus do with power? He's done a lot to imply or flat out say that Jesus has power, fame, and authority. Basically, like, no matter what your personality type, what you're interested in, Jesus is impressive. He's compared Jesus to the emperor of Rome multiple times, which is like a pretty silly thing to do, pretty comical, because again, Jesus was a Jew, not the most impressive group of people in the Roman Empire. And then he was kind of out in this backwater kind of like hillbilly area. That doesn't seem nice to say, but literally they were probably less educated. At one point in one of the Gospels, like one of the people from that area is talking and someone recognizes him just from his accent and his dialect. So like not an impressive group of people, at least to the Romans. And he's like, Jesus, the emperor. And it's like, what? So yeah. And so he's quoting John the Baptist saying that, oh, I'm not worthy to stoop down and untie Jesus' sandal. And that would be like saying like, hey, this guy is coming and I just want you to know, like, I know that you're following me, but I don't deserve to scrub his toilet. Like, what? And he's quoted Jesus even arriving and describing his arrival by saying the kingdom of God has come near. And then Jesus starts to preach and he's pointed out that people are amazed and they look and they say, wow, this new teaching is full of authority. That even their spiritual leaders, they're like, something's different about the authority that Jesus has. And then, right when he starts, the news about him starts spreading quickly throughout that whole region. So essentially, he's becoming a local celebrity. So he's saying Jesus is impressive, he's powerful, he's attention-grabbing. So that should be impressive. I think there's at least something in this first chapter that we would hear and say, okay, I kind of wish I could do that. I wish people thought of me that way. I wish I had that kind of clout. So the question we have now is, what does Jesus do with that power? What does Jesus do with power? Mark is telling us, keep an eye out for that. So as we kind of go through this study, I want us to keep an eye out for that. And I think Mark believes that Jesus is doing the right things with power. So we also need to ask ourselves, what do I think of power? What do the people around me do with power? What do they do with influence? And then I'm going to mention one other thing that Mark wants us to keep an eye out for. And that is, how do people respond to Jesus? So I think we're having some problems with the slides. We'll just get rid of them for now. There's not a bunch of information that's only on there. So if we could just knock the slide to the side, and I'll keep going. Is that good? Sweet. All right. So Mark wants us to keep an eye out for how are people responding to Jesus. In this story, the author of Mark, different stories have different types of narrators, and sometimes stories are narrated by someone who only has certain information. But Mark seems to kind of know everything that's going on, and then Jesus seems to kind of know everything that's going on. He's a fixed point. He's committed. He knows what he's doing. His character isn't changing. He's very assured. And so he's super consistent. Mark is super consistent. Jesus' mission is super consistent. But something that changes from chapter to chapter is, how are people reacting to Jesus? How do they respond? Even in this first chapter, we've seen a demon-possessed man respond by recognizing who Jesus is and being afraid of what Jesus could do. We've seen people in a synagogue respond by being amazed and interested and curious. We've seen Jesus' followers respond to his call by immediately dropping what they're doing and obediently following him. But we've also seen those followers kind of go and bother Jesus and kind of try to tell him how to do his job when he's trying to pray by himself. And then we've seen a man who has leprosy, this skin disease, respond with faith and desperation, but also with disobedience to what Jesus tells him to do. So Jesus is super consistent in his direction, his character, his motivation. But Mark wants us to keep an eye out for, how do people respond to Jesus? But again, as we go through this isn't just some sort of fiction book that we can just look at from a distance. This is making a truth claim about us, about humanity. So we also need to ask ourselves, how do I respond to Jesus? How have I responded to Jesus? How do I want to respond to Jesus? So Mark is really, really, really good. Literally 5 minutes worth of reading if you're reading out loud. If you're reading with your eyes, probably 3 minutes. And he's done a lot. He's set the scene. It's essentially a rural, small town, somewhat oppressed Jewish area. And he's introduced us to a lot of characters. John the Baptist, Jesus' followers, who are these fishermen, Peter's mom and mother-in-law, all these different people. And he's introduced us to sort of this amorphous crowd of people who are drawn to him. And so he's hinted to us that whatever Jesus does, it's a big deal. And he's done this by making references to a ton of imagery from the Roman point of view and from the Jewish point of view, and they've all converged on Jesus. And again, he's like a good guide on a crazy rafting trip. He's told us to look for certain things. He's told us to look for how Jesus uses power and look for how people respond to Jesus. So I hope all of that helps to set the stage for what's going to happen throughout this semester. I'm super, super excited for it. But before I wrap up and we transition to our next thing, I want to take us all the way back to the beginning of Mark and sit there for a little bit. So we're told it's the good news of Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. And then there's this description of John the Baptist, and it says, As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, here's the quote that describes John the Baptist. I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. So Mark describes John using someone else's words, but he describes him as a voice in the wilderness. And if you're new to Focus, every year we have what we call our theme of the year. And essentially, it's just something that we want to kind of shape our culture. So last year, our theme was the word steadfast, which just kind of means endurant and determined, and that ended up being super fitting because COVID started last year and we had to be steadfast in following him. But our theme this year is that phrase, voice in the wilderness, which just so happens to be in this chapter. Nice. A voice in the wilderness is anyone who enters a wilderness, a place that seems hopeless, broken, evil, even pointless. And they prepare the way for God to enter and to work there. I know for a lot of us, there are parts of our lives right now that feel like wilderness. There's probably someone in this room or watching this stream right now who wants to be excited about college, but they're terrified or they're disappointed. They don't even want to be at UTD, or they're directionless. They can't decide on a major. There's probably someone right now who's stuck taking online classes and they wanted to move out because they didn't have such a good home life, but they're stuck there for another year at least with people that they don't feel comfortable around. There's probably someone watching this right now who is told about Deep Dive from someone that they met like a week ago, and they're here, and that's amazing. But if they're honest with themselves, none of the people they're sitting with feel like they're their friends yet. There's people watching this stream right now who have probably thought about suicide recently. There's people watching this who have been victims of racism, abuse, just coldness. And everyone watching this right now is living in a really uncertain, hard time. I don't have to tell you that there's a pandemic going on right now and that's affecting our lives and that we don't even know all of the ways that it is. I don't have to tell you that you're taking most of your classes over the internet and that that's harder. I don't have to tell you that election years are stressful. Our lives can feel like a wilderness, but God, what he does is he takes chaotic things and he makes them make sense. He takes painful things and he makes them beautiful. The people Jesus came to didn't have influence. They didn't have status, mobility. They probably didn't feel like they had much purpose. But John the Baptist was a voice in the wilderness by saying, you who feel hopeless, who probably have not lived life well, come and wash yourself clean of everything that you've done and everything that has happened to you, and just wake up and look over there at him. Look over there at Jesus. Listen to him. He's bringing the kingdom of heaven with him. Just look at the last scene from Mark 1. A man comes to Jesus and he has leprosy. His body is probably falling apart. He's probably dying and he's having to stay away from society. I can't imagine right now getting COVID and having to shut myself off from everyone completely, including my roommates, for 2 weeks. But I cannot imagine getting something like that in that day and age and just having to shut myself off from everyone for the rest of my life. I cannot imagine that. This man heard some form of voice in his wilderness. Someone, maybe it was John the Baptist, maybe it was another person living in this leper colony with him, had said, there's someone named Jesus and he's speaking with authority, but more importantly for you, he's healing people. And he had just enough faith, just enough hope to come to Jesus and fall on his knees and just ask for healing. And Mark tells us Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and he touched the man and he said, I am willing, be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. Jesus didn't just heal this man with his voice and then move on like he could have and has done in other gospels. He saw him and was angry at what this man had gone through. He was angry at what had happened to him. And the other translation for that word indignant is filled with compassion. So Jesus sees him and he's filled with compassion. He saw the man, loved him, and reached out his hand and touched him. Think about that. This man probably hasn't been touched in years. And touching with someone with leprosy was considered stupid and dangerous. That would be like your friend texting you and being like, oh my gosh, like I just tested positive for COVID. And you're like, I'm going to go give you a kiss. It's just like, what? Like you don't do that. But Jesus isn't made unhealthy by our problems. He isn't ruined by our problems. He can handle them. He can walk up to us and say, I am willing to enter that with you. Be clean. And the man was clean. That's how powerful the voice of Jesus is. The voice of Jesus can heal. It can open our eyes to an entirely different world, the kingdom of heaven, which has come near to us. So I want you to ask yourself 2 questions. The first question is, where do I need to be a voice in the wilderness? Where do I need to be a voice in the wilderness? Do I have friends that are hopeless, that need hope? Do I have classmates that don't have friends, that need friends? Do I have family members who need patience and support? And do I know someone who needs to be told, look over there, look at Jesus, just like John the Baptist did? And the second question is there a voice in the wilderness of my life that I need to listen to? So is someone else being a voice in the wilderness that I need to listen to? Is there someone right now that stepped in and wants to be my friend? Is there someone who's trying to give me hope? Is there someone who's trying to tug on my shirt and say, look over there, look at Jesus? If there ever was a year to be a voice in the wilderness, it would be right now. And if there ever was a time to listen to a voice in the wilderness, it would be right now. In a little bit, I'm going to pray and we're going to go into our next thing. It's actually something I'm super excited for. So, our Friday night focus events used to look a lot like a church service, right? So there'd be worship music, stuff like that, and it was awesome. But that doesn't work the same way over the stream. But we still wanted to push people to interact with songs that point us to God, because there's something powerful about music. It's definitely an awesome thing. And so we're going to be doing something called Song of the Week. Each week, we're going to have a student, maybe you know them, and they'll be from the community, and they'll essentially just share, like, here's a song that really means something to me. And they might share their thoughts on it. They'll tell you the name of the song so you can listen to it yourself. And that will just give people who love music an opportunity to be influenced by that and to be impacted by it. I would encourage you to listen closely. I definitely grew up not being a fan of contemporary Christian music. Wasn't my thing. But I have been influenced and helped by worship music in a lot of ways, and just Christian music in general. So the student this week that does that will be Jackson. Super excited for it. But I'm going to pray, and then we'll go into that. God, thank you so, so much. Goodness, just for your word. Just for the book of Mark, and just for the opportunity to just get to dive into it. God, I ask that for each one of us, you would help us to learn what you want us to learn. God, I ask that you would give us eyes that see the wilderness around us, but also voices that are willing to point each other to you, and ears that are willing to listen to the people who point us to you as well. In your name I pray. Amen.
What's up, UTD Focus? My name is Jackson Nesselrode. I'm a junior in computer science, and today I want to talk to you about a worship song that's been on my heart lately. It's called Another in the Fire by Hillsong United. This song comes primarily from the book of Daniel, which at the time, around the 6th century BC, many Jewish people were being stripped from their homes to be assimilated into Babylonian culture. In one story, everyone under the king of Babylon was ordered to worship this massive gold statue in honor of the king, his kingdom, and his gods. Anybody who disobeyed was to be thrown into a blazing furnace to be cooked alive. 3 Jewish men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to compromise on their loyalty to God, however, by refusing to bow down to this man-made idol. As promised, they were thrown into a furnace, but something miraculous happened. Opposed to screaming and the smell of burning flesh, the king and his men witnessed a 4th man standing among the 3 in the furnace. Now, whether this 4th being was an angel or Jesus himself is not really the point. The point is that the 3 made it out of the furnace alive and unharmed, and that God was there with them in the fire. In the same way, this song is an expression of the same faith in God's protection in the heat of any moment. And if you feel like you're in a furnace of your own with no way out, this song is a reminder that God is right there with you. One thing I really love about this song is the lack of resolution it gives. It's not a promise that we're going to get out quick or unaffected. The three Jewish men had no guarantee God was going to rescue them at all. It's less about safety and survival and more about God being there to provide you with the protection you need to come out as the person he wants you to be. I also love how with each repetition of the chorus, the verb tense changes. We start with past tense, there was another in the fire. We move to present tense, there is another in the fire. And finally, we end with future tense, there will be another in the fire. Further emphasizing and reminding us that our battles from beginning to end are fought with the same protection and close presence of God. I want to leave you with the last verse of this song. I'll count the joy come every battle, because I know that's where you'll be. As Jesus followers, we do not need to be afraid of the blazing fires we are thrown into. God stepped down from his holiness as Jesus to bear our pain with us. And his sacrifice on the cross is proof that his love and willingness to take on our pain has no limits. We firmly believe that God is here to safeguard us and will use the fire to soften us, form us, perhaps burn us a little bit, but ultimately refine us to be more like Jesus. God will be there with you in the fire. You just have to have the faith to find his undeniable presence among the flames.